Volume and intensity. Now, these are two of the most important variables that you need to determine for a powerlifting program. Now, picture how much volume and intensity that we can prescribe for a given lifter. Prescribing too little of any will make you weaker, and prescribing too much will overtrain you, or worse, increase your risk of injury. So somewhere in between too much and too little is going to be a perfect range of viable levels of volume and intensity for optimal progress. So how do you find the perfect levels of volume and intensity in a powerlifting program? Let's find out. In this video, I will walk you through my principles and theoretical framework that I use to help me determine the ideal levels of volume and intensity to prescribe each lift for a lifter's program. Now, if you are a coach or if you're someone who self-coaches and you're programming for someone who program hops or has been coached by different people, or if you have had success in some lifts but not in others, then this video is especially useful for you. Now, the first thing we really need to understand is the concept of the training dose and how that relates to the volume and intensity. So we will need to address the question of how can the training dose be described by its volume and intensity? After you've decided on other aspects of the program, including the training frequency, the exercises, etc., there is a hypothetical optimal combination of volumes and intensity that are viable for those conditions for that training program. Intensity, specifically absolute intensity, refers to the percentage of a 1 rep max. Now, these are the two big variables that contribute to the training dose. And if there is a dose, then there is going to be a response to that dose. As a training dose is a variable that can be changed, there is going to be a range of possible outcomes to that dose. And the connection between the dose and how you respond is called the dose-response relationship. To get a sense of what training works best moving forward, you need to look at the training that has worked in the past. To understand the macro aspects of a program, I believe that there's usefulness in looking at the metrics detailing the nature of volume and intensity of that training period. Good metrics that I find useful to include, but not limited to, are total sets, total reps, average intensity, peak intensity, top sets, working sets and last set RPEs, as well as the spread of intensity. So how exact is the optimal level of volume and intensity? The truth is, there may be a hypothetical optimal level, but the range of volume and intensity combinations that are going to be effective may be larger than you realize. As there are indefinite combinations of effective exercise variations that you can choose from, there are various combinations of volume and intensity that are going to be viable. So the optimal volume and intensity is also going to depend on those exercise selections as well. Also, optimal levels of volume intensity is going to change over time. For various reasons, it doesn't just linearly increase. And between training blocks, there may be times when contrasting between higher intensity and lower volume and vice versa is actually necessary. And this may not necessarily just be for physiological reasons, but potentially motivational reasons as well. So ultimately, the ideal levels of volume and intensity must also be pragmatic as well, and be based on training availability and capacity to train to as well. And a really important thing to realize is that you'll never really be certain whether something is completely optimal. It can really drive you into the mindset of perfectionism. And ultimately, you shouldn't let this stop you from keeping what's effective. The age-old wisdom of if it ain't broke, don't fix it really applies to this situation. If you are making really good progress relative to most people, chances are you shouldn't deviate too much from this. At the end of the day, if you're a coach and your job is to create as much success as possible, and if the athlete is happy with the progress that they're making, it might not be worth changing too much. So what factors influence ideal levels of volume and intensity? Now, the ideal combinations of volume and intensity aren't fixed for you for life. What's going to be optimal for you is going to be in a constant state of flux. And then until an all-powerful AI engine can master it, most of the time, we only ever change things when they become visibly less effective. An important point to note is that you should also expect your rate of progress to reduce over time. Some factors that influence what volume and intensity is optimal for us are predictable and unpredictable. These factors can also be mutable or immutable. So genetic factors including sex, height, age, health status, muscle fiber combination, and your genetics, thanks to your parents, are majorly influential and largely immutable, i.e. not changeable. Performance level, training experience, injury history, nutrition, as well as lifestyle factors are mutable factors that influence optimal training volume and intensity. When some of these factors change over time, it doesn't necessarily always mean that you should make an active change to levels of volume and intensity, especially if your program is auto-regulated, but they will just lead to a reduction in a training response, i.e. slower progress. So what is the process of finding the perfect volume and intensity? Now, assuming that we start from a position of suboptimal and we want to reach towards our destination towards more optimal, we need to figure out what that path is. And this path should exist as a framework. As with trying to figure anything out, if we have a framework, then we have a workable process. Here is a very simple and easy way to visualize a 3-part process to finding the ideal range of volume and intensities. These parts are finding training data, find what's good, and finding what's better. Now, before I continue, if you guys really like this sort of content and find this sort of content useful, let me know in the comments box below. Now back to topic. So the first step, finding all the training data. So how to analyze previous training. Now, we need to first look back at the training that we have done in the past. If you are experienced, you may not choose to look at every single program, especially the ones that are not viable for whatever reason. But at least most of the more recent training and some of the more successful patches of training in the past should be taken into account. You then need to have a rough overview and spot the key features of each training program or training block. But how do you analyze programs, I hear you say? Well, some programs may show you some of the metrics, but if you don't, I created this really useful program analyzer that I made especially for this purpose. The link is in the description box below. Just a heads up, if you create a copy of this program analyzer, the first tab will give you the instructions on how to use this program analyzer. So just with a brief explanation on how to use this program analyzer, you just need to plug in the sets, reps, and the RPEs that was performed for each given exercise. For example, the squat, and it creates a profile of that training week or that training block. You can also compare between sample weeks from different programs. And once you've plugged it all in, it will spit out a set of metrics that really give you a good profile of the nature of the volume and intensity for that given program week or block. So the second stage is going to be finding what's good. So we need to establish what's been the best levels of volume and intensity for that lifter so far. Once you have gathered all that information and you've profiled the previous training in the past, we need to look at what has worked for us or the athletes the most. So to find the block with the fastest or largest rate of progress, we need to do the following things when we look at the previous training. We need to profile the training blocks or programs and look at the particular total sets. We need to look at the total reps, the average intensity, the peak intensity, training frequency, the spread of repetitions across percentage zones, the rate of progress by absolute load and percentage. So plot these programs on a table and or graph to visually see any patterns. An important thing to note is that this process is useful if you have exposure to a diverse set of programs. So someone who has program hopped a lot or tried a lot of different programs, you're going to have a lot of data to work off. Now, to simplify things, there can be about 4 types of patterns that you might see when you look at rate of progress plotted against the following individual variables. So the variables of average intensity, total reps, and total sets. The patterns you may find will look like the following. So the first type will be an upward trend, where it shows a positive relationship between the variable and the progress. Type 2 would be downwards, where it shows the inverse relationship between the variable and progress. Type 3 is going to be a bell curve, where it initially shows a positive relationship before it goes down into a negative relationship. Type 4 is scattered, where there doesn't seem to be an obvious relationship between that variable and rate of progress. Do you have a type 1 relationship? This means that you are likely to benefit from a higher end of volume or intensity that you have been exposed to before, with a chance of potentially benefiting from even more. If you have a type 2 relationship, i.e. downward, this means you are likely to benefit from the lower end of volume or average intensity that you have done before, with a chance of potentially benefiting from even less than this. Now, if you have a type 3 relationship, this means that you are likely to benefit from moderate levels of volume and intensity that you have done before. If this is the situation, there may be more certainty with where your optimal dose lies. If you show a scattered relationship, this may require you to look into the nature of the other variables and into the specifics of the program, of when the program was done. Now, if you find yourself to be in this situation, you may need to pay a little bit more attention to other training variables as well, including exercise selection, training frequency, or the nature of things outside of your training program. So things like your body weight. After you've plotted these, you essentially want to look at the following key points. These include where you made the most gains, where you made the least gains, including where you made no gains or even lost gains. You also want to look at where you got injured and explore why you may have gotten injured from that training block. Ultimately, you want to find which levels of variables provided you with the fastest rate of progress. If you or the athlete ever went through a really effective phase of training, but then changed the programming afterwards, you'll want to sort of explore what made you make these changes in the first place. If you ever made a change from a program and then progress got worse, your hypothesis of what you should have done will probably have been wrong. One thing that's also worth noting is the value and reliability of looking at historical data, as this largely relies and assumes conditions outside being relatively stable. So if there has been a sudden change in body weight or a stressful period of life, that's going to be a big factor that you want to take into consideration when analyzing past training, because ultimately, changes in circumstances will create a lot of noise in understanding this data. If you are dealing with an athlete who is inconsistent outside of training, or has a very volatile lifestyle, for example, if they do shift work, figuring out optimal intensity and volume probably is not going to be the priority when programming for the athlete. The priority for athletes in this camp would be to try and improve their lifestyle and externals if they can first. So moving on to the third section of finding what's better, we want to establish what better volume and intensity may be. To figure out what may be better, you may want to first consider whether there is capacity to experiment. For instance, if you are close to peaking or if you are peaking towards a competition, it might not be worth experimenting at all. However, if it's not an important competition or your appetite for experimentation may be higher, then you may decide that you want to experiment with changing some variables. If you or the athlete exhibited a type 3 bell curve, there may be less risk with experimenting, pushing the variables up or down very slightly. At the same time, if you foresee interrupted training like a holiday or inconsistent periods of training, you're probably not going to be able to get a string of good, reliable data to determine how good a training block is. Assuming that you're in a good position to experiment with changing training variables are, you need to first come up with your best theory as to what may be the best direction to take the training variables. But which variables should you control? Now, to decide this, you want to consider the following. You want to consider the feedback from the athlete and consider whether they have any gut feels or thoughts or perceptions of what they should be doing. You want to consider your perception of weaknesses that you or the athlete needs to work on. For example, if you are programming around recovery from an injury, then optimal volume and intensity isn't a priority. You want to consider where there may be room for increasing or decreasing a variable as well. A good principle that I often involve in coming up with a theory or hypothesis of what was going on before and what you should be doing moving forward is using the concept of Occam's razor, where the best explanation is the one that requires the least amount of assumptions. If you want me to make a whole video on troubleshooting powerlifting programs, tell me by clicking the like button or commenting on the box below. Now back to topic. You will then need to run what I call a univariate test, where you take on one variable and one variable only, and you perform a sort of A/B test to see whether you can respond better, similar or worse compared to the previous training program. And through reflecting upon the results of adjusting variables, you can start to build up a picture of where optimal range of volume and intensity lies. This might not always be the case, but if there is no good reason to, it is often wise to focus on controlling one variable at a time, especially if what you were doing before was already making okay progress. The reason why it can be problematic to change up the programming too much is if it works or doesn't work, you don't know why that might be the case. One important aspect of figuring out optimal levels of volume and intensity for better progress is that sometimes progress may be stalling for other reasons outside of volume and intensity of the main lifts. Good examples may include needing to go up a body weight, fixing up technique, or needing to include more hypertrophy work. How long should you stick with a program before changing up variables? Now, if you end up sticking with a suboptimal program, you'll end up wasting time. Now, obviously we don't want this. We need to have an iterative process to respond to stalling or suboptimal progress as soon as possible. Now, this can obviously range from person to person, but I like to group people into 3 archetypes: beginners, intermediates, and advanced lifters. Now, beginners are anyone with up to a year of experience. Intermediates are anyone from about 1 to 5 years of experience, and advanced are anyone with more than 5 years of experience. Beginners progress generally from session to session or from week to week, so it's very normal for me to review whether to change the training variables up to after about 3 to 4 weeks of training. With intermediate lifters, it's normally about 4 to 8 weeks, and with advanced lifters, normally about 6 to 12 weeks. After this rough time period, I will review whether, a certain block of training of that duration has been effective. So how does optimal volume and intensity change over time? Now, like I mentioned before, optimal volume and intensity is in a constant state of flux. Although short term, it doesn't change that much. As your biology changes over time, it can change quite a bit, especially when you start to approach your late 30s, then become a masters lifter. Anecdotally, it does seem like what seems to work better for masters lifters can be less volume to what they're used to be able to recover from earlier on. Lifestyle and external stresses, especially if transitioning to a different part of life, can be massively impactful on what would work well for you or the lifter. But generally speaking, if you're moving from going from a beginner lifter to an intermediate or advanced lifter, the amount of volume and intensity can generally increase over time. So I hope you guys found this video useful. So if you really want me to get deeper into very specific strategies for programming without trying to guess, please let me know by liking this video and subscribing so I can tell what to make in the future. And if you've been watching to the end, I appreciate that. So I will see you guys on the next one.